Good evening. My name is Jane Pickering, and I am the director of the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. And I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture, sponsored by the Peabody Museum and the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the museum at Harvard and the collections it stewards there are located on the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people, and we strive to honor this relationship in ways that are authentic and collaborative. Since the museum is currently closed, I come to you this evening from the Connecticut shoreline, the traditional lands of the Quinnipiac, or people of the Long Water Land. We're delighted this evening to have Dr. Miley Arvin with us, who will discuss the history of Western studies of Pacific Islander origins from a Native Hawaiian feminist perspective. But it is now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Ingrid Olgren, Curator of Oceanic Collections at the Peabody Museum, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, and good evening, everyone. Again, as Jane stated, my name is Ingrid Olgren. I am the curator for the Oceanic Collections at the Peabody Museum at Harvard. And I myself am calling in this evening from Somerville, Massachusetts, from my home here, which is situated, as is the museum, on the homelands of the Massachusetts tribe, a group of people that has continuously persevered through centuries of conflict and change. I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and becoming. And I want to encourage all of you that are watching and listening to investigate the histories of the lands that you are currently on. I am truly honored and delighted to be able to bring an exciting program to the public here tonight with Dr. Miley Arvin, with her work and a message that I think is an important one to hear. Dr. Miley Arvin is an assistant professor of history and gender studies at the University of Utah. She is a Native Hawaiian feminist scholar who works on issues of race, gender, science, and colonialism in Hawaii and the broader Pacific. At the University of Utah, she is co-director of the Pacific Island Studies. Her book, Possessing Polynesians, The Science of Settler Colonial Whiteness in Hawaii and Oceania, was published in 2019 with Duke University Press. And this year in 2021, the book won an honorable mention for Best Book in History by the Association for Asian American Studies. She is also published in the journals Meridians, American Quarterly, Native American and Indigenous Studies, Critical Ethnic Studies, The Scholar and Feminist Formations, as well as the nonprofit independent news site Truth Out. Now, on a more personal note, Dr. Arvin's work, as presented in her book, Possessing Polynesians, and particularly the work concerning the need to continue to critically untangle and call out anthropology's institutional and disciplinary histories regarding the inventions of race, came out at a critical time for my own work at the Peabody Museum. I had just launched, it's been about a year ago now, a year and a few days, just days before the pandemic closed the museum's doors, thanks to the pandemic. We had just launched, myself and co-curator Dr. Tristan Jones, based out of the Australian National University, an exhibit called Uncovering Pacific Pasts, Harvard's Early Endeavors in Oceanic Anthropology. And this exhibit was part of a global set of exhibitions across the world. Over 30 institutions, museums, cultural institutions were asked to reflect on their own institution's legacy in the development of the professionalization of anthropology and archaeology specific to the Pacific and in the Pacific region. And we have to remember that this discipline essentially started in that region, and perhaps Miley will touch on this, started with the wild speculations of Europeans and Americans, thinkers and explorers on the origins of Pacific Islanders. Where did they come from? How did they get there? And these were essentially racially motivated ideas. And their early speculations has spawned and formed the foundations of centuries of theories and methodologies that continue to influence the discipline today. And for Harvard, it became clear in developing this exhibit uncovering Pacific pasts that the museum and Harvard University has had an integral role in the development of the field, but also the popularity and kind of the scientific validation of many of these ideas. And so by tracing the intellectual history and Harvard's role specifically, we attempted to really kind of critically self-reflect and uncover some of these racially motivated narratives and hopefully make space for them to be countered. Now, as I've mentioned to Miley while reading her book, I was struck, but not really surprised by how many names in this material were so familiar to me. In her exploration on the scholarship of race in the Pacific, they were students, they were professors, and other people that had strong ties to Harvard. And so they were all familiar to me and resonating. And my copy of her book became littered with circles and arrows and Post-it notes, kind of tracing the individuals that she's talking about back to the very people that I had been talking about in the exhibit. Essentially, there's this kind of genealogy of ideas and of people that have been pivotal in this kind of racial logic and scientific obsession with the region. And so this book and the exhibit complement each other in some ways, but Miley's work really drills down and expands upon these ideas. And she demonstrates why, looking back on these racist histories that have often been dismissed as pseudoscience or no longer accepted ideas of the past, just science, that was the early days of science. She demonstrates that their study is absolutely critical and remains relevant for today. Much of this early thinking, which has been validated, it's been propped up by the Western ideals, in the name of science, curiosity, knowledge, universal humanity. These ideas and this thinking still haunts, as she calls it, Indigenous peoples today in many ways. And so there's a lot to take away from this work, and it has implications, by my estimations, beyond Polynesia and the region of Oceania. And as a scholar myself, that's the product of this academic genealogy, who works for an institution that benefited from this thinking, I'm excited about the opportunity to continue to learn, listen, and discuss this evening. And so with that, I am absolutely delighted to introduce you to Dr. Miley Arvin.
Well, thank you so much, Ingrid, for that warm introduction. And thank you to Jane and Diana and Chloe behind the scenes for running this event. It's really my pleasure to be here. I'm calling in from Salt Lake City, and that the land here is the land of the Ute, the Goshute, the Paiute, and the Shoshone people. And let me, I do have a couple of slides put together to help illustrate parts of the things that I'm going to be talking about today. So hopefully you all can see that now. But really, I want to start today by talking a little bit about how the book came to be, and then share some more details from the book related to the two main theories that I talk about in it, namely the logic of possession through whiteness and regenerative refusals. So there are really many genealogies to how I came to write this book, but I'll start by sharing a little bit about the book's personal and academic origins. So my mom grew up in Waimanalo. She lives in Waimanalo now, which is a small, largely Native Hawaiian town on the windward side of Oahu. And she grew up on a Hawaiian homestead that was leased to her parents by the territory of Hawaii in the early 1950s. And so that house, by the time that I came to know it as a child, was always full of cousins and aunties and uncles. And as beloved as that house was, as I got older, I also noticed that many people in my family struggled to have permanent, secure housing in Hawaii. Because of the high cost of living in Hawaii. And my tutu's modest house was not large enough to accommodate all of them. I also came to understand that it was unlikely that most of the other people in my family would ever receive their own Hawaiian homestead because of the notoriously long waiting list on which people still regularly die before ever actually receiving a homestead, as well as the blood quantum requirement. That requirement, which was enshrined in law, by the 1920 Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, and is still enforced today with very few amendments, states that a person must have no less than 1/2 part Hawaiian blood in order to be eligible to lease a Hawaiian homestead. So this 50% requirement needs to be proven through historical documentation, such as notations of a person's race on their birth certificate, which can often be elusive or flawed. In 2008, Kehaulani Kawanui published a book, Hawaiian Blood, about the legal history of this Hawaiian Homes Commission Act. And it provides a really essential account of the ways that Native Hawaiians fought for rights to land that had been illegally seized through the 1893 overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Due to the influence of the Big Five sugar corporations, which did not want to concede any land to Native Hawaiians, the homestead program ensured that a minimal number of lands deemed unsuitable for plantations would be leased to but never owned by Native Hawaiians. And it limited those lands to those who were, quote, no less than 1/2 part Hawaiian. So while Kawanui's book illuminates much about the legal and political construction of the 50% blood quantum rule and its legacies for Native Hawaiians, I found myself desiring a deeper understanding of the idea of blood quantum itself and the history of the racialization of Native Hawaiians. In graduate school, one of my advisors was Denise Ferreira da Silva, whose mentorship and challenging texts towards a global idea of race pushed me to seek out genealogies of race in Hawaii and the broader history of social scientific knowledge production about the broader Pacific. Such work was needed, I felt, in part because there is a popular and enduring myth that Hawaii has no racism, that it is a multicultural and multiracial melting pot where diverse ethnicities are universally celebrated. Though Hawaii is certainly more racially diverse than many parts of the continental United States, and there are really important alliances made across racial groups in Hawaii, white supremacy and settler colonialism have embedded racial hierarchy and violence within the islands for a very long time. As I began to do the research for this project, I found that this myth of racial harmony in Hawaii was tied in significant ways to an older racial fiction, namely the idea that Polynesians are almost white. At first, I could not explain white settlers designating Polynesians as almost white, but I saw it recurring so often across social scientific writings from the 19th and early 20th centuries that I was really forced to confront it. And ultimately, both myths, that of Hawaii's racial harmony and of Polynesians' supposed proximity to whiteness, I came to see are not just products of benign ignorance, but the intentional outcomes of settler colonial science that sought to naturalize white supremacy and indigenous dispossession in the Pacific Islands. In other words, social scientific questions about race in the Pacific Islands have never been innocent or apolitical, but are deeply implicated in creating and shaping racial categories that allow the structure of settler colonialism to operate. So, with this project, I also wanted to know how Native Hawaiians and other Polynesians worked with and against such racial knowledge. This led me to analyze a diversity of responses across time and medium from the early 20th century Maori anthropologist, Te Rangi Hiroa, his own writings about the Caucasoid nature of Polynesians, all the way to contemporary Native Hawaiian testimonies about the role of blood quantum today. What ties these different responses to settler colonial racialization together for me is an indigenous methodology that I call regenerative refusal. Regenerative refusals, as I'll talk more about later, are actions that seek to restore balance and life to indigenous communities through clear rejections of settler colonial modes of being. Analyzing such refusals alongside the history and present of what I call the settler colonial logic of possession through whiteness was important to my research, both personally, because it gave me some relief and hope as I slog through these very racist social scientific texts, but also because it demonstrated consistently that settler colonial logics have never gone uncontested. Okay. So with that, let me jump into the book. So really at the heart, at its heart, the book is a critical history of the question, what is a Polynesian? This question is one that I've encountered personally many times in my life. And sometimes the question is just kind of geographical, right? Sometimes Polynesia is misunderstood as referring solely to French Polynesia, which is the French territory that includes Tahiti, rather than the broader region that encompasses over 1,000 islands and more than a dozen independent countries or territories. Others are unsure after learning that I'm Native Hawaiian, which is a subset of Polynesian, what that means exactly. Some insist that means part Asian, right? Or what percentage of Hawaiian are you? But aren't all the natives extinct? That I, like many Native Hawaiians, am multiracial with Chinese and Haole or white ancestry as well, often seems proof to them that their suspicions about Hawaiian extinction are correct, however long I might spend explaining why such notions are both false and harmful. So there's a really long history to such questions and the attendant proprietary sense that many white Americans in particular display when they decide that my answers are not sufficient and that they actually already know what a Polynesian or Native Hawaiian is. Indeed, since the earliest encounters between Europeans and Indigenous Pacific Islanders, white Europeans and later white Americans expressed a fascination and partial identification with the racial origins of Polynesians. So to British Captain James Cook and others, Polynesians seem to represent so-called natural man in his purest state. So European painters such as William Hodges, that you can see his painting Tahiti Revisited here on this slide. He depicted Tahitian women in the style of classical Grecian bathers in the 1776 painting. And it's a little hard to see probably on your screens, but there are small figures in the lower right-hand corner that are supposed to be Tahitian women, but look like very much like classical Greek figures. So in later social scientific studies from the mid-19th century through the mid-20th century, such ideas about the racial origins and classification of Polynesians became the subject of intense scrutiny and debate. So while these theories shifted over time, the enduring logic that Polynesians could be understood as more natural or classical or otherwise primitive versions of white civilizations remained throughout changes in social scientific trends. This logic really persists to this day, from the daily exotification of light-skinned Hawaiian so-called hula girls as understood as naturally available sexual conquests for visiting white tourists, to complicated matters of legal recognition for Native Hawaiian people. So the central argument of the book is that settler colonialism in Hawaii and Polynesia more broadly is fueled by a logic of possession through whiteness. In the logic of possession through whiteness, both Polynesia, the place, and Polynesians, the people, become exotic feminized possessions of whiteness, possessions that never have the power to claim the property of whiteness for themselves. Instead, the Polynesian race is repeatedly positioned as almost white, even literally as descendants of the Aryan race, in such a way that allows white settlers to claim indigeneity in Polynesia, since according to this logic, whiteness itself is indigenous to Polynesia. This logic naturalizes white settler presence in Polynesia and allows white settlers to claim, in various ways, rightful and natural ownership of various parts of Polynesia. Notably, this idea of whiteness making itself indigenous in order to control and own a place violently attempts to replace the quite different definition of indigeneity held by many Polynesians and other indigenous peoples, which emphasize relationships and responsibilities to land as an ancestor. So today, white social scientists no longer claim that Polynesians are Aryan. Whiteness, like all forms of racial ideologies, has never been a completely stable or unchanging concept. Yet the historical production of Polynesians as very close to whiteness in social science continues to authorize white claims to ownership over indigenous Polynesian lands and identities. This is true despite the fact that whiteness is often unmarked as such in scientific discourse, more often operating through the language of the universal universal or the so-called good of mankind. Nonetheless, as Toni Morrison has written about tropes of Blackness in the writing of white American writers, this quote, "The subject of the dream is the dreamer." So too, the Western racial construction of Polynesians from the 19th and 20th centuries reflects the self-referential concerns of the West and white anxieties over their own shifting definitions of whiteness and humanity. And so while whiteness is commonly the name referent in these studies that I'm looking at, anti-Blackness is also always a significant part of the Western construction of the Polynesian race as almost white. Like indigeneity, Blackness is so often simultaneously invisible and hypervisible. So ideas about Polynesian being almost white were always formed in distinction to ideas about Melanesians being Black. And so this is another map of the region. It actually comes from Te Rangihiroa's work in the 1930s. He was that Maori anthropologist that I mentioned before. And this map is laying out some of his theories about where Polynesians came from. And so you can kind of see the different routes mapped out, some with like big question marks that he didn't really think Polynesians came from Peru, for example. But Te Rangihiroa actually really believed that Polynesians came through from Asia through Micronesia into Polynesia, but that Polynesians had come through Micronesia before it was settled by Micronesians, and so there was no kind of ancestral racial mixing between Polynesians and Micronesians, and that there was definitely no racial mixing with Melanesians, which so Melanesia is this distinct oceanic region west of Polynesia and south of Micronesia. And it includes the present-day countries of Papua New Guinea, West Papua, the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, New Caledonia or Kanaki, and Fiji. And imperial and settler images of Melanesians projected fears about savage, dark-skinned cannibals and were used to justify practices of kidnapping and forced labor. Blackness, as understood in the continental U.S. in reference to African Americans, also at times played a significant role in racial discourses in Oceania, especially in Hawaii and other parts of the Pacific where the U.S. had power. So, for example, in the period surrounding the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893, U.S. media repeatedly portrayed King Kalakaua and Queen Liliuokalani as pickaninnies with the same tropes that they would portray pickaninnies, and spread rumors about them having African-American ancestry in order to discredit them as legitimate rulers. And there's a lot we could say about these cartoons, but this is just to give you an idea. Such racist images were enabled by discourses about Polynesians' proximity to whiteness, rather than being a break from them. For whiteness in relation to Polynesians always remained a question and a problem, despite accumulating social scientific knowledge over decades declaring various definitive answers. The question, what is a Polynesian, was always implicitly or explicitly a question about whether Polynesians were white or Black. White settlers wanted Polynesians to be whiter because it suited their own claims of belonging to Polynesia, while it also soothed colonizers' racial anxieties about those that they dispossessed. This book, therefore, analyzes how Western fears about Polynesian Blackness through ancestral or more recent relationships with Melanesians and African Americans haunts the logic of possession through whiteness in deep and complex ways. These fears about Polynesians' potential proximity to Blackness are also always wrapped up in fears about Polynesian indigeneity, threatening and undercutting the claims to indigeneity, power, and the resources made by white settlers in Polynesia. So overall, Possession Polynesians investigates narratives about Polynesian whiteness, not to reveal truths about Polynesians per se, but to expose the foundations of settler colonial power in a possessive form of whiteness that must be divorced of its claims to indigeneity on the path to decolonization. My goal is not to provide a more so-called appropriate racial classification for Polynesians, but to show how racial knowledge, which is never stable but often shifting, has been and continues to be central to settler colonialism in Polynesia. In this sense, the book is a critical genealogy of whiteness in Polynesia, more than it is a history of Polynesianness as self-determined by Polynesian peoples. Yet what I show here is that the history of how and with what consequences constructions of Polynesianness, whiteness, and Blackness have intertwined through enduring settler colonial ideologies, and how Polynesians have alternatively accepted and refused them. So given the increased but varied usage of settler colonialism as an academic term in recent years, I just want to also briefly note how I define the concept. So settler colonialism as a structure of dominance is particularly set on the exploitation of land. Though never monolithic or unchanging, settler colonialism is a historical and a contemporary phenomenon. Its power usually operates simultaneously through the economy, such as the turning of land and natural resources into profit, the law, such as the imposition of legal political apparatus of a settler nation state that replaces an indigenous form of governance, and through ideology, which means the culturally and morally defined ways of being and knowing resulting from European post-Enlightenment thought. And so I really see what I'm talking about here with the logic of possession through whiteness as one strategy that is deployed within the ideological power of settler colonialism, which is often in articulation with, but irreducible to, the economic and juridical forms of governance that also constitute settler colonialism. Okay, so with that kind of introduction, I'll start by sharing a little bit from my book's second chapter. And really the first half of the book traces the development of the logic of possession through whiteness through social scientific literature that was referred to as the so-called Polynesian problem. This literature began around the 1830s and continued for at least a century, delving into what was considered the mystery of Polynesians' geographical and racial origins. I looked specifically at 19th century ethnology that constructed Polynesians as Aryan and thus sharing an ancient ancestry with Europeans. Then I look at physical anthropology of the early 20th century, which conditionally classified Polynesians as Caucasian. And then early to mid 20th century sociology, which created the idea of Hawaii as a racial melting pot, in which the end result of all that racial mixture would be whiteness. And I'd be happy to talk more about any of these chapters in the Q&A, but for now I'm going to just share a bit from the second chapter and this history of physical anthropology. So one of the physical anthropologists that I look at in that chapter is Louis Sullivan, who worked in Hawaii in the 1920s. And he was in Hawaii in a joint appointment between the American Museum of Natural History in New York City and the Bishop Museum, which is located in Honolulu, Hawaii. And Sullivan was hired by both institutions to undertake a so-called definite investigation of the Polynesian elements in the Hawaiian population, and to direct the production of a collection of photographs and plaster casts of living subjects that would be used in the American Museum of Natural History's exhibition halls. The photographs and plaster casts were seen as very vitally important data for the eugenics field. And eugenics at this time was a major component of progressivism, the movement to address longstanding social problems through various forms of institutionalization and scientific modernization. So eugenicists' views towards Native Hawaiians were not necessarily explicitly anti-Hawaiian or anti-Polynesian. Indeed, Louis Sullivan saw himself as something of an advocate for Native Hawaiians, especially for the so-called part Hawaiians. So speaking at the Second International Congress of Eugenics in New York City in 1921, Sullivan remarked that, quote, "The part Hawaiian is biologically a better individual than the full Hawaiian, more capable of coping with modern conditions of life and civilization." Thus, Sullivan championed mixed-race Native Hawaiians because, in his view, they were more quickly losing their their qualities of their race and indigeneity as they assimilated into modernity. Sullivan believed that racial mixing was a boon to the Native Hawaiian race because he believed in so-called hybrid vigor, which is a concept that held that racial mixes were healthier and more well-adjusted than so-called pure Hawaiians. Sullivan used anthropometric methods to obtain physical data from Native Hawaiian subjects. And so these methods included measuring the stature or height, span, head length and width, anatomical face height, nasal height and width, physiognomic ear length, height, and breadth. And this slide shows you some of those measurements that he even wrote a textbook or kind of manual to help standardize these practices. And so in anthropometry, all of these features were compared to the average or common features of other races and used to construct ideal racial types. So this is an image from his like handbook or manual. And then these are some of the facial casts that Sullivan directed and had displayed at both the American Museum and the 1921 Second International Eugenics Congress. So each facial cast that you see here was made from live subjects, and they're carefully notated with that person's kind of breakdown of their so-called like blood quantum. So some were simply labeled Chinese man, while the Native Hawaiian subjects had much more detailed fractions, allowing viewers to imagine the effects of racial combinations. So the captions inked across the chest of the 54 facial class included, for example, the ones you see here are, the first one is Hawaiian 1/4, white 3/4 woman. The figure in the middle is Hawaiian 7/8 and Chinese 1/8 man. And the last figure is Hawaiian 1/4, white 1/4, and Chinese 1/2 man. So scholar Anne Maxwell has suggested that white American audiences would have viewed these so-called racial type facial casts and other similar photographs as a way to, quote, predict what would happen if other racial groups were allowed to mix with white Americans, and if reversing the sex of the parents for each racial combination made any difference. So in addition to producing items for the American Museum's Polynesian Hall, Sullivan also understood his work as pursuing a more refined or complex answer to the classic Polynesian problem. In practice, Sullivan found this work challenging as he found Polynesians to be what he called a so-called badly mixed population with a wide range of physical characteristics. To account for such differences, Sullivan came to argue that there were so-called two types of Polynesians. He called them the Polynesians of Polynesia. Those are the ones he thought were kind of the true, authentic Polynesians, alongside the so-called Indonesians of Polynesia. And Sullivan illustrated these types in a 1923 article, and you can see some of the images from that here. Here he contrasts the Indonesian type, and the caption, if you can't read it fully, says he represents the so-called Mongoloid element with Negroid characters. And that is compared to the so-called Polynesian type. And the caption for that one is, in him, nature seems just to have missed producing a Caucasian. And I think, yeah, there's a lot more to say about these images too, but I think maybe just most obviously, if you didn't have these captions, right, I think it would be quite difficult to make the kind of divisions or characteristics that Sullivan is assigning to these men, right? But in general, we see that Sullivan's creation of one kind of blacker type and one kind of whiter type of Polynesian clearly echoed longstanding social scientific distinctions between so-called Black Melanesians and almost white Polynesians. So Sullivan was arguing that these same black and white distinctions existed within the Polynesian race itself. To Sullivan, then, Polynesians might not be Caucasian, but they were, he argued, a so-called decided step in that direction, or they were descendants of Caucasians, perhaps having branched off near the stem. So this is really what I'm talking about when I talk about the logic of possession through whiteness. Because this is making a conditional identification between Polynesians and Caucasians that does not attempt to equate Polynesians with true Caucasians. Rather, Polynesians to Sullivan were, quote, unsuccessful attempts of nature to make a Caucasian. So to him, they had some natural potential to become Caucasian, but it is implied they would not be able to achieve that status without intervention or guidance from other truer Caucasians. Racial mixing between Polynesians and white settlers was therefore viewed favorably by Sullivan because he saw such mixing as hastening the true whitening of Polynesians and ushering in an undoubtedly white future of Hawaii as it became more integrated into the United States as a U.S. territory. Sullivan's research focused almost exclusively on Hapa-Haulis, or Native Hawaiians who also had white ancestry, usually individuals who had lighter skin color and could sometimes pass as white. Of course, Native Hawaiians mixed not only with Haulis, but also other Asian immigrant populations. But scientists like Sullivan encouraged the public to understand mixed-race Native Hawaiians as whitened, no matter what the actual mixture was. Doing so downplayed the salience of racial difference in Hawaii to white American settlers who remained a demographic minority there despite wielding a monopoly over political and economic power in the territory. So just to acknowledge, a lot of this history is really difficult, right? It's really racist, and it's like often just difficult to like kind of wrap your head around the kinds of logics that these social scientists were really deeply invested in. So now I'm going to just kind of move to the last part of the talk where I talk more about Polynesians' actual reactions to some of this logics. And so, yeah, in part 2 of the book, Possessing Polynesians, I analyze how Polynesians respond to, critique, and co-opt the logic of possession through whiteness in contemporary realms of law, science, and art through what I term, as I said before, regenerative refusals. Regenerative refusals are actions that seek to restore balance and life to Indigenous communities that continue to live with the structures of settler colonialism. In dialogue with the theories of other Indigenous feminist scholars, including Leanne Simpson, Audra Simpson, and Lani Teves, regenerative refusals are, in my framing, concerned with divesting our communities from racialized and gendered hierarchies. Indigenous feminism seek to draw attention to how settler colonialism is fundamentally a gendered process that relies on the installation of heteropatriarchy to destroy colonized communities' connections to their bodies, to each other, and to the land. Regenerative refusals seek to restore these connections, often through the clear rejection of ongoing colonial ideologies, both imposed upon and sometimes deeply internalized within Indigenous communities. So regenerative refusals in my usage are not about a return to exactly what things were like before. They are an ongoing reckoning with settler colonialism rather than a denial of it. So I'm going to share a little bit more about regenerative refusal as I write about it in chapter 6 of the book, particularly in relation to contemporary Indigenous Pacific art and the work of Samoan artist Yuki Kihara, whose work graces the cover of my book. Chapter 6 is about how many contemporary Indigenous Pacific artists confront audiences with the ongoing violence of the colonial gaze on Indigenous bodies. Such art is difficult in scholar Jennifer Doyle's sense, in that it requires viewers to witness the colonial ideological production of the Polynesian and questions the viewer's complicity. So I argue that Indigenous artists drawing attention to this production is necessary to the larger Indigenous project of regeneration, creating and imagining Indigenous futures where other relationships and different gazes might be possible. So Doyle's analysis of difficulty in contemporary art also resonates with Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson's theorizing of ethnographic refusal in anthropological settings, wherein she asked us to consider stops, such as the stops or silences in an interview, or other impediments to knowing, as expansive in what they do not tell us. Yuki Kihara's work, I argue, embodies refusal in the sense that it subverts viewers' expectations of receiving so-called authentic information about Indigenous cultures or Indigenous feelings, as well as viewers' understandings that colonialism is a thing of the past, long since settled. So, for example, Kihara's series, A Study of a Samoan Savage from 2015, includes a number of photographs, most of which feature a Samoan man being subjected to anthropometric tools that are being held by a white hand that, as you can see here, just kind of juts out of the side of the frame. And you can just see the sleeve of the white lab coat. So these tools explicitly reference not just anthropology, physical anthropology as a field, and anthropometry as a more particular kind of methodology, but also specifically the work of Louis Sullivan, that physical anthropologist that I was talking about earlier. So the subject of Kihara's study is an embodiment of Maui, the Polynesian demigod who slowed the sun and fished up the islands. So like Sullivan's anthropometric photographs, Maui in Kihara's work is photographed apparently nude. And unlike Sullivan's work, in Kihara's images, the anthropometric subject seems to glow in warm tones of brown skin that shine against a black backdrop. This warmth contributes to the portrayal of Maui as both human and otherworldly, in contrast with the disembodied white hand, which stands out starkly against the black background. This Maui stares directly at the viewer, or in portraits that are oriented in profile, directly at the off-screen scientist holding the calipers to measure the size of his nose. Played by the Samoan artist Ione, his expressions appear defiant and annoyed at the probing metallic tools measuring his nose and skull. The tools appear sharp and potentially painful, though Maui's blank, resistant expressions betray no signs of being harmed. So Maui's countenance reminds viewers that he is a trickster and a shapeshifter, who could likely easily escape not only the anthropologist's calipers, but this bodily human form for another life form. And so in this other piece from this series, which is titled Sprinting, it deepens the association with shapeshifting by framing Maui running in a staggered photographic sequence. This futurist influence image, like other works of Kihara's, shows him still nude in progressive actions of sprinting from a crouched start with one knee bent to a seemingly full sprint where he appears to be running full tilt out of the frame. Most of the figures are staring directly at the viewer as he takes off with an alert and wary expression, as if he is running away from both the viewer and the anthropologist. In the last two figures, Maui has turned his head to look forward and out of the frame, as he perhaps escapes the white settler gaze and the logic of possession through whiteness that Sullivan invested in through such anthropometric studies. By running out of the anthropological frame, Kihara's Maui provides both a powerful rebuke to the violence of settler colonial science and a regenerative alternative history in which Polynesian ancestors get to refuse and frustrate anthropometrists like Sullivan. Maui is an akua, or god and ancestor, to most Polynesian peoples and some Micronesian and Melanesian peoples too. So by choosing Maui as the imagined subject of settler colonial science, Kihara provides a broad swath of Pacific Islanders a connection to this series and deliberately flaunts the designation of Samoan savage that an anthropologist might use to label Maui. The joke here is on the scientist, who does not realize Maui's mana or power, and by extension, the mana of all Indigenous Pacific Islanders. Yet the representation of Maui by a Samoan male artist and the series title Samoan Savage also evokes more specific references to Samoan men, as scholar Lisa Uberessa has noted. connecting the series to the evaluation of Samoan men as so-called natural athletes or savage players. Uparasa argues that, quote, foregrounding their punishing physical sporting performance may draw the cheers of the crowd in rugby or gridiron football, but it emerges from and remains tethered to racist imaginaries that ultimately continue to reinforce hierarchies, stereotypes, and ceilings based on racialized opportunities in the settler colonial Pacific nations, as well as in the US, UK, and beyond. So here again, we really see anti-Blackness bleeding through the construction of an ideal white Polynesian race that many actual Polynesians and Polynesian men in particular cannot fulfill in real life, as they are often stigmatized and criminalized for their dark skin. Kihara's series therefore centers the gendered aspects of settler colonialism and racial anthropometry, in part by so powerfully focusing on the gendered and racialized body, as she does in her other works as well. Okay. Well, I think I'll try to wrap up just by saying a few things from the book's conclusion, and then really look forward to talking with Ingrid and others about any questions you have. So the refusals that I analyze in part 2 are not just about voicing dissent, but also about enabling a transformed and liberatory future. Indigenous refusal, then, is not necessarily limited to a refusal to say something or a refusal to look a certain way, but as Audra Simpson's notion of ethnographic refusal signals, a broader refusal to participate in the production of natural, so-called natural, authentic, Indigenous subjects who might be easily apprehended and utilized by Western social scientific knowledge production, Western contemporary art canons, or Western linear history. Regenerative refusals therefore push Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples and places into relationships that deeply threaten settler colonial framings of time and space. So in refusing settler colonial knowledge production of the Native or the Polynesian, Indigenous activists and artists do not just gaze back at the West, but look elsewhere to their own desires for themselves and their people. Regenerative refusals recognize violence and pain, but not to make that the center of Indigenous identity. Rather, these refusals highlight the importance of envisioning and enacting different futures that are suffused with more love, humor, connection, and freedom. This is why the energy surrounding the Kia'i, or protectors at Mauna Kea, and the powerful Kanaka Maoli testimonies against federal recognition in 2014, both of those things I talk more about in the book, was electric even for those watching and supporting from afar. For even in the face of what seemed to be unwinnable or unchangeable circumstances, in these cases, people dared to refuse and demand a different future. Refusals allow for a blooming of desires beyond the strictures of settler colonialism that pretend to be eternal and unchangeable, and beyond the settler assumption that Polynesia and Polynesians are and will always be the possessions of whiteness. There's a lot more to say, but I think I'll end there so we can have some time to talk more. So thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. I know it must be hard to condense years of work and a book into a 40-minute presentation, and there's so much there. So I really want to recommend people to pick up the book because it really is great. So it does look like we have a few questions coming in, so I'm just going to dive in. This first one asks, how does the background you describe help explain the current negative stereotypes and discrimination against, quote, Pacific Islanders, end quote, in Hawaii, and the narrowing of this term in popular usage to refer almost exclusively to Micronesians?
Thanks for that question. So I think my work has a lot to do with that context that you bring up, and my sense is, especially in Hawaii in the last decade or so, Micronesians have been racialized in a way that is partly it's partly an anti-Black racialization, right? That they're understood as kind of the like ignoble savages from another part of the Pacific that that aren't really supposed to be in Hawaii, right? That's all the kind of racist ideology that frames Micronesians in Hawaii, and it really erases, many things, but especially the history of the U.S. imperialism in Micronesia, and the history of nuclear testing in Micronesia that the U.S. government did, that created a lot of necessary diasporas from Micronesian islands, and many health issues that many Micronesians cannot find treatment for in Micronesia, but have to come to Hawaii for, right? And so, my work is more focused on, really just kind of the implications for all this racial history, the implications of the construction of Polynesians as so-called almost white. But as I said, that construction is always dependent on, the co-construction of ideas of Melanesians as Black, and then Micronesians could often in these old racist scientific studies that I look at, Micronesians were sometimes kind of lumped with Polynesians and sometimes lumped with Melanesians. And so my sense is kind of continuing from this racist and racial history of social science. Today, some of the ideas about some of the racist portrayals of Micronesians are drawing more from the kind of the history of Melanesian racist racial constructions, if that makes sense. And so, all of this is really, the impact of all of this has been really devastating in many ways, but I think in the context that you're pointing out, it's particularly devastating that because it breaks connections between different Pacific Islanders, right? And because of the ways that many, sometimes our communities internalize some of these ideas, it really breaks the ability for communities to really recognize and honor the relationships and like ancestral genealogies that we have to each other. And so one hope is that my work provides some of the history to help us understand where some of those divisions came from in order for us to do something different, right? Like we don't have to keep perpetuating, racist ideas about Micronesians. We don't have to keep perpetuating internalized ideas about Polynesian exceptionalism.
Yeah, thanks. That whole situation is a whole series of talks, right, in and of itself. And there's a lot to unpack there as well. And I'll just add on, perhaps, that I'm kind of curious about, one of the things that struck me about your book, but also about your personal introduction just now, is how this kind of strong early desire for Polynesians to be white or be almost white or proximally white was really, it didn't benefit Hawaiians, right, in that process, right? It was only to the end of benefiting white settler colonialists, right? And so I think that's an interesting point that you bring out in your book. If you wanted to comment more, that's up to you. But about how being named proximally white doesn't actually give you any benefits in particular for Hawaiians or other Polynesians, right?
Yeah. And I mean, there's a lot to say about that. I guess I could share, I do talk some in the book about kind of ideas of Polynesian exceptionalism, which has a lot of different historical examples, but one that comes from actually the work of my colleague Kailani Cook and his book Return to Kahiki. He talks a lot about King Kalakaua's kind of attempt to form a so-called like Polynesian Confederacy in like late 1800s that would that would have tried to kind of counter European imperialism and colonialism into the Pacific. Kaylani's work points out that there are many reasons that the Confederacy didn't ultimately work out. I mean, a major one was the bayonet revolution that really limited Kalakaua power. But also something that kind of damned it is that Hawaiians kind of went to Samoa, proposing this confederacy, but they also came with ideas about how like Native Hawaiians were like supposedly like more civilized than Samoans, right? And so that's an example of like even within like both Hawaiians and Samoans are Polynesian, right? But there was this idea that came, I argue, from this logic of possession through whiteness, that Polynesians were somehow, better than other indigenous peoples, and that got. As it trickled down, one consequence of that was that, Kalakaua's confederation, believed that Hawaiians were like closer to white than Samoans were, and by going to Samoa, that they could help Samoans become whiter, right? And so that, I'm saying all this not to like judge Kalakaua or too harshly, but to point out that like these ideas, they and the ways that they're internalized, they place real limits and constraints on how we relate to each other. And so even if some of these ideas seem very like, pseudoscience or just like really old and outdated, I mean, of course they are. But I think the kind of underlying point of my work is that there are some really insidious ways that these ideas have been internalized by Pacific Islanders, and I don't have all the solutions as to how to undo that, but I think just one way is to start confronting it more, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm cognizant of our time, so I'll just ask, maybe we'll go just a couple minutes over time, if you don't mind. There's a question here that came in that says, what do genetic studies show of Polynesian ancestry and relation to other races? And I might tag on or rephrase that to let you maybe answer, how does DNA and advances in DNA kind of travel along with this longer history of desire to understand race in the region?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the books, the 5th chapter of my book talks directly about this. So I wouldn't say that genetic studies today are like, directly saying the exact same things that these older anthropological studies said, right? But I think to some extent, they're motivated by similar desires, and sometimes the way that they're structured, they're not critical of kind of the colonial framework of some of these questions about where Polynesians came from, right? And so so I guess that's one way to answer the question. But I mean, just factually, I guess many of these genetic ancestry, genetic mapping studies today, some say that Polynesians came from Asia, like various routes through Asia into the Pacific. But there are also ones that claim various routes or, some kind of, maybe not origins in South America, but they try to prove that there was ancestral voyages between South America, indigenous people in South America and Polynesia. And so for me, like those studies, it's not that they're necessarily like totally bunk, but again, I just think they're often the scientists who do them, even with the best intentions or the ways that they're reported in the media, can often be very anti-Indigenous in the sense that if you want to know where Polynesians came from, you should ask Polynesians, right? Or like these kinds of studies should be, shaped in significant ways by Polynesians themselves and the kinds of questions that they might have about their histories, and not by kind of, non-Polynesian scientists who kind of have these, have different motivations. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really, it's interesting about like who gets to define what indigeneity means and what race means. And I think those are important things that you address in the book. You're getting several questions coming in, some interesting stuff about the lost tribe of Israel, and also contemporary sort of tensions with Asian settler colonialism in Hawaii, Japanese, Filipinx, migrant workers, lots of interesting stuff here. But we are running out of time. So one thing, I think I'll mention this one kind of comment or exhibit, and then I'll ask you one last question. It looks like there's an exhibition that recently opened at the Bishop Museum called Regenerations, Challenging Scientific Racism in Hawaii. And it looks like there they implement kind of Sullivan's photographs and how they may have taken on different meanings and purposes for Native Hawaiians. And so Stacy's got a question about that perhaps you guys can have a outside conversation about. But I did want to end with this kind of two-part question, or two different questions that you can choose which one you want to answer, I suppose. But it says, thank you, of course. And it says, we are now in the 21st century. Why the demeaning and dehumanizing narratives against Polynesians? Why are they so difficult to change? And then the second question is, how is the concept of regenerative refusals being viewed in academia? So it's up to you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Hi, Stacey, and thanks for that shout out for the Bishop Museum, that new exhibit. And I know about that exhibit, and I think my work is kind of being cited in it in some ways, and so I'm really excited to see what they've done with it. For the other question, I kind of understand the frustration with the first part of that question, just like, why are we still dealing with these racist ideas, and why is it so hard to get rid of them? And I totally empathize with that feeling. But I guess for me, the reason is like, we're still in it, right? We're still living in a world that's really structured by settler colonial and racist ideologies. And so I think the things that I try to talk to my students about when I teach these kind of histories is always, racism isn't just like a personal, it's not just about someone's personal perspective, which we can easily label as racist and dismiss, but racism is a really important structural force, right? And so that's, to me, that's an important reason why it's not easy to just get rid of it, because it's not just people's personal viewpoints, but kind of the way our lives, our governments are structured that continues to operate through these logics. So, yeah. The second part of the question, I guess my book is, it's a little bit old now, but in academia, it's still fairly new. So I think I haven't it's to be seen, like how people will receive the regenerative refusals. But I guess with the exhibit that Stacey mentioned at Bishop Museum right now, that it does seem like there's that it has kind of struck a chord, and that it can offer something to people who are trying to grapple with these histories and the legacies that they have in the present.
Thanks. Yeah, I hope academia in and of itself can be a space that can foster more and more of these regenerative refusals, despite the fact that it is entirely a kind of Western grounded set of institutions. So it remains to be seen. But we have run out of time. So I want to say, Miley, that I am so grateful for you sharing your time. And it's really special to hear your powerful work kind of in your own voice come out of your body. So I'm really grateful for that. So thank you. And Thanks to everyone for joining us. I'm so sorry we didn't get a chance to answer everyone's questions. I encourage you to reach out to Miley directly or to myself if it's related to the exhibit in the museum. And also, pick up a copy of her book. It's really wonderful. It's a great read. So thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And have a good evening, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much.